Good afternoon, YouTube. Warbles on a lot here. I'd like to talk a little bit about Israel and Palestine. And before I begin, I'm going to set the record straight as to what I know about Jews. My father's first wife was a Jew. The Jews count their lineage down the matriarchal line. That means that my half-brother and my half-sisters are Jews. My mother's brother married a Jew. I'm not a Jew. I have no innate reason to think badly of Jews. I got 6 years at Catholic boarding schools in my adolescence, and I heard quite a few anti-Jewish jokes. And we studied a bit of history, and I was an aeroplane freak. And to immerse yourselves in aeroplanes, you've really got to study the history of war, because that's what's pushed aeroplanes along. And the Germans in 2 world wars, they had the best fighter pilots. So I immersed myself in the German fighter pilot culture. And I could not help but notice that the Germans had pretty much fought and lost the Second World War because of their national hatred of Jews. Before the Second World War, Adolf Hitler had described his Third Reich as having a Jewish problem. It was described in terms of the Jewish problem, what to do about the Jewish problem, how he could get the Jews out of Germany. And nobody wanted to take Germany's Jews before the Second World War. Some of them managed to escape to Palestine. I knew a couple of German Jewish refugees who went to Palestine and didn't like it there in 1938 under the British, as Palestine was a British mandated territory following the British victory in the First World War. So those 2 German Jewish refugees from Adolf Hitler, they came to my hometown in 1939. And they were still getting around in the 60s when I was a kid, and they were very pleasant people. Years later, I married a woman whose parents spoke German and Hungarian. And in a New South Wales country town, you find all the guttural European language speakers stick together in a bit of a flock. So I wound up with that particular German Jewish refugee from Adolf Hitler playing cards in my kitchen every week with my mother-in-law, the last unreconstructed Nazi cannibal. And there was another lady who had married a Polish cavalry captain who'd managed to survive the experience and join the Canadian paratroopers. So I've at various times been as sympathetic as it's possible for an Australian atheist, as I was at the time, to be to the Israeli cause. But over the years I've watched the way the Israeli government behaves towards the Palestinians, and I've slowly, gradually come to recognise that the Palestinians have the same relationship to Israelis as Australian Aborigines have to British colonial occupation, or American Indians have to the Europeans who showed up there. The excited states of North America and Canada is built on the idea of manifest destiny, that it is God's mandated will for the white people with the guns to take over all that rich land and all those resources, because the natives didn't have the firepower to stop it. Therefore God goes with the big battalions. The reason the British government decided it was okay to steal Australia was because of the doctrine of terra nullius. This was land that belonged to nobody, according to the English view. Therefore it was acceptable. Stick a flag on it and parcel it out and give it to English squatters. Send convicts to it, work their arse off for a while and then give them the dirt they were standing on. Well, after Hitler had tried to do what he could think of to deal with what he called the Jewish problem, everybody in the world was on a guilt trip and felt sorry for the surviving Jews. And the surviving Jews had come to understand that anywhere in the world they seemed to annoy the shit out of their neighbours. For some reason, the Jews don't appear to be able to get along with their neighbours. And according to the Jews, it is never the fault of the Jews. It is always the fault of the neighbours who don't like them. And there were various plans. Somebody wanted to put them on Madagascar. Somebody else wanted to put them on the northwest pointy end of Tasmania. But eventually it was decided, they keep praying about next year in Jerusalem, why don't we stick them in Palestine, in the British mandated territory of Palestine? And the people who were in favour of that plan coined a slogan, a land without people for a people without a land. And all that required was the genocide, or otherwise removal, of 500,000 Palestinian native locals who'd been living there for thousands of years. And that's how the refugees from the Third Reich, who didn't like being described as Hitler's Jewish problem, that's how the Zionist government of Israel came to acquire the Palestinian problem. And now, in the middle of November 2012, just before the ancient Mayans said the world was supposed to come to an end, the Zionist government in Israel's decided that it's time to call up 30,000 troops in reserve ready to hammer the Palestinians in Gaza, because after 67 years of being persona non grata on their own ancestral homelands, they've started making firecrackers and putting them on skyrockets and firing them in the general direction of their occupiers and oppressors. You know, it's a really, really funny thing. But for the first 600 years after Jesus was nailed to a tree, the reason the Christians said they didn't like the Jews was because the Jews would not keep the commandment against usury. Usury is paying or charging interest. Once you introduce usury into a loan, then a person who's got some spare money can make that money grow because the money makes money. If there's no usury and you've got some spare money, you're only going to lend it to somebody if you think they're going to be able to pay it back, but if they can't pay it back, it won't matter. If usury is involved, you can charge them a 10th or a 20th or a 5th of the value of the loan every year for borrowing the money. You can make them pay back the interest before they start to pay back the capital. You can ensure that a farmer has no fallow year. You can turn a rainforest into desert by growing your economy, by charging interest on loans. From Zoroaster to Deuteronomy to Moses to Jesus throwing the moneylenders out of the temple to Muhammad forbidding usury. Every God theory worth a pinch of shit to the compost heap has said usury is wrong. And the Jews decided that Deuteronomy, who said thou shalt not charge interest to thy brother, had given them a loophole, which meant that Jews who consider themselves God's chosen race, because Abraham had a vision, oh, I see, the crops are failing, so I'd better go and kill me firstborn son. Is that right, God? Fair enough. Oh, just about to chop the throat and God says no, go and kill a bar lamb instead. Oh, yes. That's why the Jews are God's chosen race, because Abraham, the schizophrenic who heard voices, told them so. Their umpty-ump great-grandfather says they're God's chosen race. So they give interest-free loans to their brothers, the other Jews, and everybody else gets to pay through the nose. So everybody else gets to turn their land into desert, and the Jews wound up with the money. And strangely, that caused their neighbours not to enjoy their company. It's happened all over Europe. And when they annoyed the shit out of their neighbours in Europe to the point where, Germany decided to have a Holocaust. Bad decision, wicked, evil, stupid decision in the eyes of any benevolent, peace, love, brown rice and alfalfa sprouts type God theory, a ridiculous decision. But that seems to be where it's come out of. The Jews are really, really good at acquiring wealth, while the people surrounding them are really, really good at discovering poverty. Why is Israel still surviving? Because America props it up. 60% of the United States foreign aid budget goes in military supplies to Israel. Why is that so? Because it keeps the American military-industrial complex factories running. And that's necessary to the US Congress, because if you shut down an arms manufacturer in the United States, a congressman loses votes in his home seat. And that is the case because during the Second World War, the congressmen wangled it so that every one of them got a military base or an arms factory in their electorate. So each one of them could go home and say, look, see, I brought you these jobs because of the war. And it means America is locked into a war mentality due to its politics. So America has been feeding arms to Israel for 67 fucking years. It's a never-ending place to send your spare tanks and guns, because the Israelis know they're surrounded by Arabs. They know the Arabs regard them as usurpers, trespassers, and the Israelis are fucking terrified. And any time an Arab looks like he's going to stand up to the Israelis hammer him with American weapons. Israel has a Palestinian problem, just like Hitler had a Jewish problem, and the white supremacists in Australia like to think that we have an Aboriginal problem, and the white supremacists in the excited states of Norte Americano like to think that they have an Indian problem. The problem is one of justice. The problem is one of equity. The problem is you may have to accept the fact that your ancestors were fucking wrong. The problem is you may be the bloody problem. If I had my way, somebody could flip a magic little switch in the sky and every weapon on the face of planet Earth, every machine that's been built for no other purpose but to deal death and destruction would melt. Be interesting to see how long the Israelis lasted, if the only way they could last anywhere would be to get along with people, to be nice to their neighbours, to stop trying to argue from a position of strength, to abandon the idea that the Lord God of all creation, the shaper and ruler of everything in the universe, has a preference for any one tribe or clan or family or geographical district based on what was said thousands of years ago in the head of a schizophrenic who was about to cut the throat of his own firstborn son because the crops had failed. Israel has a Palestinian problem, and it's going to continue to have a Palestinian problem as long as it occupies somebody else's homeland, and as long as they want to think that they are God's chosen race, and therefore they are entitled to occupy somebody else's homeland. And as far as I know, the Creator God of the universe does not favour the big battalions. So in the long run, the longer you hang on to your gun, the worse you're going to come undone. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.